Well, good morning, everybody. At least it's morning for me. I have no idea what time you guys are listening and viewing all of this, but today we're going to talk about breathing systems. This is chapter 14. Now, hopefully I didn't confuse you with the last lecture where I said that was chapter 14. That was a mistake. It actually is chapter 13. I've made adjustments in some of the online stuff, but I wasn't going to go back and re-record the lecture. So hopefully you all figured that out. Okay, but this is actually chapter 14 on breathing systems, and then in our next lecture, I will talk about chapter 12. I'll go back to chapter 12, and we will talk about bird sex at that point. I just felt this was kind of a better order to do things. So, breeding systems. All right, so birds actually exhibit a wide variety of reproductive systems, okay? But however, as we have stated a number of times in this class, by far and away the most common breeding system is monogamy. Now, monogamy is defined as an exclusive pair bond between individuals of the opposite sex. So one male, one female, okay? And as I mentioned, this is by far and away the most common breeding system that we see in birds. There's the second place is not even close, okay? We've also, as a subcategory of this, defined in earlier lectures the concept of social monogamy. And social monogamy occurs when these pair-bonded individuals involved in the monogamous relationship engage in extra-pair copulations. So in other words, they engage in sexual interactions that are outside of their pair bond, okay? So this is kind of a subgroup of monogamy. Now, the next type of breeding system, so monogamy is, that's a pretty easy one to understand, and I'll reiterate the fact that the reason why it's believed that monogamy is the most common system is because of the cost of raising young, okay? Having two parents involved in raising young is energetically favorable to successfully fledging chicks. Now, a second type of mating system that we see in birds is called polygamy. And polygamy is any mating system where a member of one sex will engage in pair bonds with multiple members of the opposite sex, okay? This is not very common, although there are a couple of notable examples of this that we see in birds. Now, there are several types of polygamy. The first that we'll talk about is a type that's called polygyny, okay? So don't get the terms polygamy and polygyny mixed up. But polygyny is a mating system in which a male will form multiple pair bonds with other females, okay? So he will pair bond with more than one female. About 2% of all birds engage in polygyny. So, and this is actually a high number, of birds outside of this massively common realm of monogamy, okay? Male reproductive success, I should say, in polygynous systems tends to be much more variable than it is for females. Now, if you think about it, this makes sense because males will vary widely in the number of females that they will pair bond with. So if you remember from chapter 13, we talked about how red-winged blackbirds, and we see a red-winged blackbird here on the screen, how females are really after the quality of their territory. And so if a male has a really good quality territory, then a whole bunch of females are going to come and pair bond with this male so that they can build their nests on this territory, all right? However, if a male doesn't have quite as good a territory or the territory is not as big, he will have fewer females, and that will result in lower reproductive success. From the female perspective, if she's got a nest, she's got a nest. And so her reproductive success is going to be driven more by the proportion of offspring that she fledges than the males is going to, whereas the male is just going to be influenced by the number of females they have, and that's going to result in a much greater variability. So I suspect that you guys probably get that. Okay, now this video up here, this is just kind of a precursor. This is just kind of a precursor to chapter 12. Let me turn the volume down here so I can hear myself talk. Okay, this is a precursor to bird sex in chapter 12, and the reason that I wanted to show you that video was because bird sex is a really short-lived thing. It doesn't last very long. Okay, and what we often call an actual copulation between a male and female bird, we call it a cloacal kiss, because number one, most birds do not have external genitalia. Now, ducks are an exception to this. Ducks, waterfowl are an exception to this. I believe some of the ratites are also an exception to this, but most birds have no external genitalia. They basically, put their cloacas together, and sperm is transferred from the male to the female, and this is a very, very quick interaction, as you saw in those house sparrows in the video. And we'll look at another video of that when we get to chapter 12. Okay, so back to polygyny, and I misspelled polygyny in oh no, that's polygamy. Never mind. So back to different types of polygyny. Polygyny can be divided into two broad categories. The first is what we call territorial polygyny. Now, this is kind of a relatively new category, at least as far as I can tell. Your textbook in this edition, they did not do it in the last edition, actually breaks polygyny down into these two broad categories. So this is a relatively new subdivision of polygyny, and what this refers to is a type of polygyny where a male pair bonds, and actually pair bonds, okay, and that's the key word here, pair bonds with two or more females. It is a sustained association, okay, and this is what defines this particular category. So red-winged blackbirds would be an example of territorial polygyny. They defend an area that's a pair bond with females. Females come and nest in this territory, and the relationship between the male and the females is sustained over a period of time. And again, few species exhibit this type of a system. The second type of polygyny, and this is actually a really new subdivision of polygyny, is what's called either lek or arena polygyny. And in reality, your textbook tends to kind of separate lek and arena, but they're really not different in terms of the dynamics of the system. This particular type of polygyny was formerly a separate category that we called promiscuity. Okay? Now, what defines this particular category of polygyny, now that it's been folded into polygyny, is that this is all about sexual relationships between male and female birds. It is very brief. There are no actual pair bonds formed. It used to be that the category of polygyny was defined by the fact that a pair bond existed, but now they have moved what was formerly promiscuity in under the umbrella of polygyny and renamed the category lek or arena polygyny. In this particular type of polygyny, the males play absolutely no role in nesting or raising of young. They copulate with a female, and that's it. You know, that their role in the whole reproductive process is done. This is actually the second most common system next to monogamy. Now, I say it's the second most common, but still, it is way, way, way less common than monogamy is. Okay, so it's still uncommon, but there's a lot of notable birds that actually practice this sort of behavior. Hummingbirds, for example, and I'll give you an example of this in a moment, practice this sort of behavior. Hummingbird males do not participate in nesting or raising of young at all. Okay, let's talk a little bit about leks. All right, since we brought them up. You know, until a year or so ago, when we would go to Malheur, and sadly that's not happening this year, we would get up early one morning and drive out to the Foster Flat sage-grouse lek and watch these males come into this rather small area and then just display for an extended period of time in the morning. And then the females would come to basically choose a mate. Okay, so lekking occurs over a small area. Sage-grouse are an example of this. But leks actually can be larger. All right. So back in 1942, do I have the? Okay, maybe not. In the next slide, I'll have this reference. But back in 1942, Frank Patelka defined a new category of lek that's called exploded leks, and this is where birds will have large display areas, individual display areas. But these display areas will be grouped in a much larger area. So you can have several males that will hold display areas in a large common area. But they function very much the same way as these smaller leks that are exhibited by the sage-grouse. And I'll show you a sage-grouse video in a moment. Okay. And on these areas, whether it be a small lek or a larger exploded lek, the males will engage in elaborate displays to try to entice females. And then the females will just come and stroll through the lek or fly through the lek with the goal of evaluating the quality of the males to try to choose a mate. Now, historically, it's generally been thought that you may have a lot of males that are involved in forming a lek, but relatively few males actually get the majority of the matings with females. You know, I'm not really sure that this has been well validated. I'm not sure how many molecular studies have been done to test this. In all honesty, I have not looked at the literature in the last few years to see if maybe there's been some definitive proof of this idea, but that's generally the thought, that there are one or two good males in a lek and all of the others don't get much in the way of matings. Okay, so let's take a moment here and let's turn the sound back up and let's go ahead and watch a video of a sage-grouse lek. Oh, I guess I got to start it with my hand. Okay, so that was just a rather well done video illustrating the displays that male greater sage grouse do. And as I said, we used to actually go and visit that on our visit one of those leks on our trips to Mal here. The last couple years, the lek has not existed. Habitat destruction, a lot of things have really impacted the lek that we can go see, and now people really keep secret where lek locations are, and so finding another one to go visit has been a challenge, but maybe someday we'll be able to do that. Now, the sage grouse are only one example of birds that form leks. And so I want to look at another species now, and we've actually seen some examples of this group of birds in some earlier lectures. But these are leks that involve some passerines, a small group of birds called the manakins. And they also form these small leks, and the males come and display. And so I'm going to show you a video here about Kim Bostock's work from many years ago on the red-capped manakin. And this is kind of a fun one for you guys, because this is referred to as the moonwalking manakin.
In Latin America, Kim Bostwick believes she has discovered a contender for the kingbird's crown. It's the manakin. Most jungle researchers can't get near their subjects, but Kim's birds are positively jumping to be noticed.
They don't mind me being here, and they kind of show off. That's actually what their whole life is about, is showing off what they can do so that the females can be impressed and also mate with them. Right there, we just heard a male doing a little bit of a courtship display.
The displays of these manakins are so fast that there's no way the human eye can see what they're doing. But with high-speed imaging, the secret of their dance can finally be cracked.
This little baby was the breakthrough for my research. It's a high-speed video camera that enables me to record at 500 frames a second. Your average camera goes at 30 frames a second, which means you're missing 90% of what's happening. So with this camera, I'm able to capture these behaviors and play them back in slow motion and just look and see what they're doing.
The big mystery is how these birds make their peculiar high-pitched calls. The images from the high-speed camera show clearly that the sounds come not from the bird's mouth, but from its wingtips. At 80 hits a second, this is quicker than the speed of a hummingbird's wing. A movement so fast it is invisible to the human eye. And there's more. The dance of the red-capped manakin has another surprise in store. Kim's knowledge of the bird's ritual is now so intimate, she knows every move.
So, first thing you do is you're sitting on your perch and click, you fly away. Once you're out there, you come swooping in, do a loop-de-loo in the air, land on the perch, and at the end of that, what the males do is they lean over, lift up their tail, quiver the tail slightly, and nail their feathers against their sides. And now you're going to do a moonwalk, and this is the only known case of birds moonwalking to my knowledge. But they basically do these little steps backwards, and it looks like a Michael Jackson slide. It's very nice.
Michael Jackson's moonwalk can be found in the jungles of Central America, then who knows what we might find next.
Okay, well, I hope you enjoyed that. Anyway, there are many species of manakins which are known to be good lekking birds. Okay. Now let's talk about an example of an exploded lek. So yeah, I'm going to toot my own horn here for a moment because I studied one of them for my master's degree. You've already seen this image in a previous lecture. Breeding Anna's hummingbirds hold some really big territories. So the boundaries of this territory are almost 13,000 meters squared. So these territories that a single 4.5 gram male can be greater than 1 hectare. And so for those of you who don't speak metric acres, a hectare is 10,000 square meters. Okay, so really large. And what males will do is they will hold these territories, on hillsides, and you may have these territories that are kind of right next to each other that are scattered throughout an area. And it was this behavior of this very species, actually, I think it was this species anyway, that Frank Patelka back in 1942 termed as being an exploded lek. And many hummingbirds have been described as exhibiting lek-like behavior. The hermit hummingbirds in South America and Central America are well known for being lekking birds. But even another species that I work with in southeastern Arizona, their breeding system has been described as being a lek by a study back in the 1970s. All right, these territories, and we talked about this back when we were talking about territoriality. They are not established for food resources. They are established to be display areas for females. So the males, they will come in November, early December, and they will establish these territories. So if we can all remember when we were on campus earlier this semester, we could hear the Anna's hummingbirds singing all over this campus. Those are males on these territories, and they are very spread out. Okay? And at least in Southern California, and I'm pretty certain that they go pretty much as long here in Oregon, they will defend these territories through May. And what happens is the females will come, they will engage the males within these territories, and then they lead the male off on an extended chase. And in addition to the dive displays that the males do, it's not until the end of this extended chase that the females lead the males on that they make a decision as to whether or not they're going to mate with that male. You can imagine what it's like for the male who goes through all this effort, and then at the end of the chase he says, nah. Okay. So anyway, this diagram came out of a paper I published clear back in 1987, so actually a couple years before I came to work at George Fox. Okay, a third type of polygamy is what we call polyandry. Now, polyandry is basically the opposite of polygyny in that it is a type of polygamy where a female will pair bond with several males. In these systems, it is the males that incubate the eggs. It's very rare. Okay, so a couple of slides ago, I had a picture of a Wilson's phalarope. Wilson's phalaropes. In fact, all the phalaropes and actually several other species of shorebird exhibit this type of a system. Then, one other thing that I'll say about polyandry is this is a system in which the females will often have elevated testosterone levels. This is a type of a system where females often exhibit reverse sexual dimorphism and will be more colorful than the males. Okay, now we get to one of the weirdest groups. It's a type of polygamy that's called polygynandry. That's a mouthful for you to pronounce. This is a type of polygamy where females will pair bond with several males, And males will pair bond with several females, so it goes both ways. Okay? Wrap your head around that one. This is sort of a type of what you would call communal breeding. Males and females are kind of shared with each other. It's a big party. Okay? Also, the different breeding groups, they will share in defensive territories, and they will also share in parental care. So this is truly a village raising a bunch of kids. Now, a large group of primitive flightless birds, the ratites, and the ostrich is included in this, exhibit this type of a system, and a few other, what I label here as weird species, do as well. Okay? And in fact, in this picture here, you can see a couple of little young ostriches that are trailing. I don't know whether this is a male or a female. One difference between what the ratites do and what other birds do. So in this last bullet point here, it says paleonaths. Okay, this is essentially the ratites. So the ostrich, rhea, emus, those birds. The males do all the incubation in those particular birds, these more primitive birds. But the clutches that they're incubating will be eggs laid by multiple females. Okay, so you can see this is really quite a mixed up system. So here are some breeding records from a type of a thrush that exhibits polygynandry. It's Bicknell's thrush. And this is kind of a busy diagram, but all I really want you to notice out of here is that when you look at all of these squares, which represent individual males and females, all the lines that connect them are indicative of some sort of a bonding between those individuals. Okay, and then down here, you can see that it might just involve feeding. It might involve siring an offspring if it's a male, feeding and siring, and so forth. And when you look particularly at this group over here, you can see that that females are having eggs fertilized by multiple males, and multiple males are fertilizing eggs in multiple females, and they're engaging at different levels of care for the female and the resulting offspring. So you can see here, it's just quite a mixed up mess. And this is what polygynandry looks like. So this is an example from Bicknell's thrush. So you can see the Bicknell's thrush is quite a bit different from an ostrich. Okay, so there is not anything specifically taxonomic that drives the development of this type of system. There must be some other selective pressure that causes this type of system to be favored. And again, it's not very common. All right, let's switch gears here and talk about brood parasitism. So brood parasitism is a totally different type of reproductive system, and it represents a form of what we call cheating. It's considered cheating because what brood parasites do is they pass the costs of incubation and rearing of the young off to somebody else so they don't have to. All right? Brood parasitism involves one bird laying an egg in another bird's nest. This allows females to actually substantially increase the number of eggs that they produce each year without incurring any of the cost of parental care. So you can sort of see why something like this under certain circumstances might be favored. But the consequence to the individual who's having to rear these eggs that are a result of parasitism is that the genetic relationship between the host individual, the parents, and the eggs that they're taking care of is going to be diluted because they are not going to have any genetic relationship to those eggs whatsoever. Now, there are a whole bunch of species out there that practice what we call intraspecific brood parasitism. And this is where individuals of an individual will lay their egg in the nest of another individual of the same species. The value in doing this is that the egg is going to be incubated, hatched, and raised by an individual who's going to teach that young everything they need to know about being that species. So the process of becoming a fledged adult in this sort of system does not require a divorce between nature and nurture. Okay? The adult training of the offspring versus genetic encoding of the instructions for becoming the species of bird that you happen to be. These eggs tend to be supplementary to eggs that are being laid in the nest of the host individual. Now, this can be problematic. American coots practice this extensively. So here's a graph on the right side of the screen at the bottom here, where we have basically fitness increments. So in other words, you have eggs and it's going to contribute a certain amount to your fitness. And basically what you see is you have much more, if you only lay one egg, virtually all your fitness is invested in that egg. And as you lay more eggs, then the amount of your total fitness that is invested in each egg declines. Which means losing one egg out of a clutch is less of a big deal than losing the only egg that you lay, right? And so in the case of coots, you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, down to 10 eggs. Each egg still has a positive contribution to fitness. But once we get above 10 eggs, so 11, 12, 13, then the fitness increments become negative because the cost of incubating and rearing becomes so high that what it likely does is it really makes it difficult to energetically sustain the entire clutch. And so it ends up being a fitness detriment. So in this case, the optimal number would probably be 10 eggs here. You can imagine what would happen if a parasite then comes in and starts laying eggs that are over and above what you have laid when you think about the fact that you are likely going to try to lay the optimal number of eggs. It could push you over that limit. Okay, and so that can be problematic. Lots of groups known to practice brood parasitism, and I've just listed a few of them here for you. But this is far from an exhaustive group. There's a lot of groups of birds that actually will do this. Okay, so intraspecific brood parasitism will increase when nest sites tend to be rare. Okay, you're having a bad year, you just don't have good nest sites. And so rather than not reproduce, if a species is inclined to practice intraspecific brood parasitism, then they will start to do it more frequently in order to have some reproduction occur even in a bad year. Cliff swallows is interesting because in colonies that have more than 10 pairs, roughly a quarter of all the nests end up being parasitized. And you can imagine it would be hard to parasitize, you would think, a cliff swallow nest because of these little mud enclosures that they stick in high density underneath cliffs or bridges. So brood parasitism, as we pointed out in the last slide, will reduce the reproductive success of the females because either one, the genetic relationship to the eggs will be diluted, or two, it will push the female's clutch beyond what's optimal, making it difficult for the majority of the young to survive. And if it's not her young that are surviving, then that is definitely a reduction in reproductive success. Timing is really important to when brood parasites lay their eggs. Females will remove foreign eggs that are laid before they start laying. And this is from a study in European starlings. So if a parasite comes in and lays an egg in an empty nest, the female who owns the nest comes in and says, I didn't lay that egg, she'll kick it out. So to prevent this from happening, what parasite starling females will do is they'll wait till after the female has started laying, then the parasite female will come in, remove one of the host female's eggs, and then lay their own. And this does a couple of things. It masks the fact that the number of eggs has changed, and two, increases the likelihood that the clutch, when it's complete, will stay around the optimum number of eggs. Okay? Only they won't all belong to the host female, and the female, again, genetic relationship to the clutch will be reduced. So we have a couple of graphs over here that we can look at to kind of illustrate who's impacted by what. These top two graphs here are plots of clutch size and chicks fledge as a function of being parasites and non-parasites, and in terms of the non-parasites, it's hosts and non-hosts. We can see that clutch size for parasites, they generally tend to lay about 8 eggs. The hosts will generally tend to lay about 8 eggs, and that's likely because parasites have added eggs, and so the host ends up laying fewer eggs in order to keep egg number around the optimum. And here we see that in non-hosts, the number of eggs laid is a couple of eggs higher. In terms of fledged young, parasites and non-host females tend to do equally well. So they will fledge a little less than half of their clutch. And this tends to be about 1 chick less in a host. So there is a reduction in overall reproductive success. This is a similar graph to what we looked at in the last slide. You can see that unparasitized females have a much higher clutch size optimum than host females do. Host females, their optimum is going to be a couple of eggs less because they also have to take care of a couple of parasitized eggs as well, okay, in terms of fitness consequences. Okay, so that is intraspecific brood parasitism. And it's generally thought that intraspecific brood parasitism is on the evolutionary road to what we'll in a few moments call obligate brood parasitism. But an intermediate step that is believed to occur is what we call facultative brood parasitism, and facultative meaning kind of occasional parasitism. And this parasitism is not intraspecific, it's interspecific, but generally one species is parasitizing another species that's very similar to it. A classic example of this is cross facultative brood parasitism between black-billed and yellow-billed cuckoos. They look very similar, they have a similar niche, and if one raises a chick from the other, it's it's close to all the benefits we talked earlier about in terms of not having to divorce nature and nurture aspects of rearing young, because they are very similar species. Okay. As this type of parasitism becomes more successful, then you would expect that the frequency of parasitism would increase. This is likely also to be impacted by number of available nest sites, just like we saw in intraspecific brood parasitism. All right, let's look at just a couple more videos here that illustrate examples. This first one is kind of a fun example. We've talked about wood ducks being cavity nesters, but mergansers, hooded mergansers are also cavity nesters. And they parasitize each other. This is kind of an example of facultative brood parasitism. Although, the similarities are interesting in terms of nesting habitat for this species, but one species is a dabbling duck and one is a diving duck. So how that works, I really don't know. But anyway, let's watch this video of a
wood ducks have apparently co-evolved with hooded mergansers, though they differ in many ways. These species have entirely different feeding habits. Wood ducks are dabblers and eat mostly plants, while hooded mergansers are divers and eat mostly fish and crustaceans. Yet their nesting habits have converged to a remarkable degree. Both species use similar nest cavities and nest boxes. Their interaction goes beyond that. We have observed both species laying eggs in the same box, then to be incubated by whichever species holds title to that box. For example, 2 years ago we had a hooded merganser incubate mostly her own eggs, but she also hatched 2 baby wood ducks, who then leaped from the nest box and joined her on the lake. She accepted them fully in her role as foster mother. This is an amazing bit of biology. In our box on April 19th, the wood duck incubated the eggs overnight, leaving the nest box in late morning. At 12:35 in the afternoon, a hooded merganser entered the chamber while the original wood duck was gone. She was in the box for about 9 minutes. She uncovered a few eggs at first, then she became quite still and began laying an egg to add to the pile. You can see her body rhythmically contracting during this video. Afterward, you will see the fresh egg, which appears larger than the others in the nest. When she is done, she begins pulling the blanket of down feathers and wood chips over the accumulated eggs to protect them. As soon as they are covered, she leaves the box. When the wood duck returns, she will not be aware of the merganser egg added to her box, and she will begin incubating it as if it was her own.
Okay. All right, so let's look at the final category of brood parasitism, obligate brood parasitism. Obligate brood parasites never build their own nest and never raise their own young. They totally depend on other species for their reproductive success and the parental care of their young. There are a couple of groups that do this pretty regularly. Up at the top here, we have a picture of brown-headed cowbird, which all of you should be able to see before the end of this class. And many cuckoos, for example, will practice this sort of brood parasitism. By eliminating the cost of parental care, and this is true for any of the categories of brood parasites I've talked about, whenever you can eliminate the cost of parental care, you can lay more eggs. You have energy to use to make more eggs. All right. So obligate brood parasites can lay an incredible number of eggs every year. Brown-headed cowbirds are known to lay as many as 40 eggs per year, yet they only deposit 1 egg per nest. Now, you've got to put this kind of in perspective. Obligate brood parasites can be incredibly hard on host species for a number of reasons. When we get to adaptations, that make brood parasites successful, you'll kind of see why. But brown-headed cowbirds in particular in this country have created a number of ecological issues for endemic species, simply because they parasite such a high proportion of their nests. It's believed that obligate brood parasites only lay one egg per nest because it increases the probability of fledging the maximum number of your young. And it's almost like, the whole concept of flocks that we talked about earlier. By spreading them out so much, it reduces the probability of any one individual being predated. It generally takes less time for an obligate brood parasite chick to develop, and so they hatch before the young of the host species, if the host species eggs are still in the nest. And this allows the chick to grow and be dominant over the nest when all the chicks do hatch. It is rare that host chicks survive in the presence of a brood parasite chick. Okay, so here is a cowbird that is going to lay an egg in a northern cardinal nest. This is a female brown-headed cowbird here. So, did you notice that the cowbird actually removed one egg? Looked like it may have been trying to do something to the other egg, but left the same number of eggs in that nest as were there when it started, before she laid her egg. Also notice that the cowbird egg was a little bit smaller. Okay, more on that in a minute. Just kind of keep that in mind. Now, when you look at a host species raising the chick of a brood parasite, and lots of examples of the cowbird, it's mind-boggling that the host species doesn't recognize this. So here's an example of a song sparrow feeding a cowbird chick. Look at the difference in size and appearance. So there's the song sparrow. There is the cowbird fledgling. Okay. Now, it's pretty incredible, you know. Those two birds are totally different, yet that song sparrow thinks that that chick belongs to it. Now, here's one that's even more terrifying. Cowbirds literally will create hosts for themselves. They will destroy an active nest with nestlings in order to force the parents that are raising those chicks to re-nest, to create an opportunity for that nest to be parasitized. So here's an example of that happening. So this is a warbler. This is a warbler's nest. And so there's a female brown-headed cowbird just walking in there and taking all the nestlings and dumping them out onto the ground. Okay, so the take-home message from this is cowbirds in this country can devastate populations, absolutely devastate populations, and you can probably see why. So brood parasites, obligate brood parasites have some adaptations that help to promote their activities. Their eggs tend to be fairly thick-shelled, and so they resist cracking. And then when they're dropped into the nests, they can sometimes damage host eggs because it's almost like dropping a rock in there. But they themselves tend to withstand that pretty well. Parasite chicks are larger often. They grow more quickly, making them dominant. And often, even when host chicks do end up hatching, what will happen is at some point they will get pushed out of the nest. They beg more, and so they tend to get fed more than smaller chicks as well. Eggs can often mimic the coloration of the host egg. So if you look at this picture up here at the top, you'd be hard pressed to find the cowbird egg in this nest. Okay? And how parasites do this is a bit of a mystery. But it doesn't have to be this way, okay? If you look at this nest down here, clearly that blue egg looks different than the other eggs that are in that nest. And why that egg is not recognized is also a mystery. Now, unlike either intraspecific or facultative brood parasitism, the genetic identity, the identity of a obligate brood parasite chick, and that includes brown-headed cowbirds, which I specifically listed here, it's totally based on genetics. They learn nothing from the host parents. Well, I shouldn't say nothing. I'll give you an example of where they may mimic a song in a moment. Okay, and here's the moment. Okay, so if you have a brood parasite, and the village indigo birds are an example of this, they will learn the song of the host species, and then female indigo birds will select mates specifically on the song that they sing because they can identify the host heritage of that particular male. So that's one thing that they may learn from the host. But in terms of understanding that they are a brood parasite, that is totally hard-coded genetics. Very different than what we see in other birds. All right, brood parasitism, as I've emphasized, is really costly to populations. And so as you might suspect, selection does favors strongly the development of what are called counter adaptations. means to thwart the parasites. The simplest form is just simply to be diligent in defending your nest against the parasites. All right? So recognizing what species are parasites and which are not. Interestingly, a very simple adaptation is to know that brood parasites, obligate brood parasites, often lay their eggs in the morning. And so some species will just simply sit on their eggs for the first half of the day to prevent access to the brood parasites. Some species will actually recognize the eggs of brood parasites and remove them. It's puzzling to me why this adaptation does not develop in more birds, because there's a lot of birds that don't. And then the costliest counter-adaptation is to simply abandon your nest when you note that, that it's been parasitized. And the decision to do this is because the nest will fail if that parasite egg hatches. And so why invest the energy in it? Now, interestingly, and this is something that your text pointed out, this form of counter-adaptation usually only occurs in regions where parasitism is high. The frequency of parasitism is high. And they use American robins as an example because American robins will do this in regions where they are frequently parasitized, but populations of robins in regions where parasitism occurs less frequently, the robins are less likely to do this. So there is definitely a regional differentiation between how frequently this particular counter-adaptation will be used. Okay, one more breeding system to talk about. Cooperative breeding. Cooperative breeding occurs when you have a pair that uses the help of other birds to raise their young and defend perhaps some sort of a territory. And these other individuals that will help raise the young we refer to as helpers. The benefit of this sort of a system, particularly to the helpers, is not overly obvious. There are some ideas we'll talk about. The best described example of cooperative breeding is in the Florida scrub jays, and that's what's shown here on the slide. They will have a social unit that involves the breeding pair and then up to 6 helpers. The helpers are often younger birds. They are not breeding individuals, and they defend the territory to protect and again feed the young, as we mentioned earlier. And here in the bottom picture on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see a helper feeding a young. Cooperative breeding has been described in a whole bunch of species, more than 200. However, it is still not very common relative to monogamy. So, there are 2 prevailing hypotheses as to how helpers benefit by being helpers in a cooperative breeding system. If the helpers are relatives of the breeding pair, then by aiding the breeding pair in the raising of their young, they produce genetic relatives, okay? So it is an indirect way of passing on some of your genes. This is what we refer to as kin selection. And I'll show you some data on this in a moment. If the helpers are not related to the breeding pair, then they will perhaps help with the expectation that down the road they will be helped. when they become part of a breeding pair. This is referred to as reciprocal altruism. Okay? One or the other of these may be correct. They may be both correct. It's highly likely that, in fact, it's almost certain that cooperative breeding has independently developed in multiple taxonomic groups. So it does not have to have the same motivation for helpers. All right, so here is a possible, some possible support for kin selection. White-fronted bee eaters, and you guys have a required reading to do on this. Close relatives of the brood are more likely to help because it increases what's called their inclusive fitness. So, on the x-axis here, we have a measure of how related the helpers are to the brood. Over on the left y-axis, we have the percent probability of individuals helping. And then over on the right y-axis, we have a measure of gain from helping, and this is in equivalent offspring. So in other words, that brood being related to you is going to pass on a certain proportion of your genes. When you add up all those genes that are being moved to the next generation that you share, what is the offspring equivalent of that? Okay? And what you can see as the more related the bee eaters are to the brood, the higher the probability of them helping, and the more of this inclusive reproductive fitness that they experience. So something like this would lend some support to the idea of kin selection. Some interesting physiological things. There are really not any obvious differences in hormonal cycles between breeders and helpers. Testosterone levels in males, they peak at the same time, although the helpers are a little bit lower, but there are some other reasons potentially for this, namely that they're not breeding. Estrogen does tend to increase to higher levels in helpers during the incubation stage of nesting, but most people think that this is a result of these helpers kind of dispersing during the incubation period, perhaps trying to find their own territories during that time. And that may totally be unrelated to the fact that they have actually engaged in helping. So there are not any obvious physiological differences that have been clearly identified in helper birds. The presence of helpers absolutely plays a role in increasing nesting success. So here are data for two species of bird, the Florida scrub jay in blue and another species of cooperative breeder, the gray-crowned babbler in green. And what you see is without helpers, fledgling success is about half of what it is when helpers are present. So the helpers actually really do help. Okay. It might be beneficial for birds to become helpers in times when the territories or when environmental resources are limiting. And we have two examples here from your textbook. And so, the idea that a helper gains through kin selection or reciprocal altruism may not be a big deal in a year where resources are abundant. They would much prefer to basically have their own territory and nest. But in difficult years, perhaps it's better than nothing. And so here, for acorn woodpeckers, and acorn woodpeckers, which is a bird that we can see locally, they are cooperative breeders. In fact, Walt Koenig wrote a book on this. My PhD advisor did some energetics work on cooperative breeding in acorn woodpeckers. And note the x-axis here, annual territorial vacancies, all right? The high numbers of vacancies are on the left. Low numbers of, a high proportion of vacancies. Oh, let me talk about this, right? Yeah, high proportion of vacancies on the left. We got that right, and basically no vacancies here on the right. So, not very many vacancies available on the left. No. A bunch, or no vacancies. Let me try that one more time. There are no territorial vacancies on the left. A whole, I just messed that up again. Okay, take 5. A bunch of territories available on the left here, 100%. Okay, got that? There are no territorial vacancies here on the right. And what you see in acorn woodpeckers is when we get no territorial vacancies, the young birds all stick around and help. Okay? Hopefully we all got that. All right? For the white-fronted beater, the species that we looked at, now here on the x-axis, it's another reversed axis like we had over here. We're looking at total rainfall. We have a lot of rainfall here on the left, low rainfall here on the right, and high rainfall means a lot of food resources available. Low rate of helping here on the left, high rate of helping here on the right when rainfall is low. So this would imply that resources are driving the proportion of the population that is actually helping. Okay, hopefully you all get that. Whew! All right, well that's it. That is chapter 14. So we'll catch you all next time when we will talk about bird sex. Come and Zoom with me once in a while, maybe just to say hi, just so I can see your smiling face, and we'll catch you next time.